The first tape ran for 11 minutes and 43 seconds before Corporal Yara Ose hit the pause button with her thumb and sat very still in the dark. She had been a signals intelligence analyst for 9 years. She had processed intercepts from 3 active war zones and once, during a particularly bad winter in the Outer Territories, had listened to a full hour of encrypted Keth communications that described, in meticulous biological detail, what happened to human tissue at pressures above 40 atmospheres. She had not flinched then. She sat with her headphones and her notepad, and her cold cup of tea, and she had done her job. Now she sat with her knees, drawn up to her chest in a folding chair inside the evidence lockup of Forward Operating Station Mira, and she could not make herself press play again. The room was a converted supply bay, 3 walls of steel, shelving still half-stocked with ration packs and filtration canisters. 4th wall was a bare composite panel with a single mounted screen. The screen had a basic media interface, military grade, no frills. A counter in the corner read 11:43. 11:43 paused. She reached over and pressed play. The footage resumed mid-movement. A hand, Keth, unmistakably Keth. The 4-fingered silhouette, and the faint phosphorescent tracery running along the dorsal tendons, was reaching into a container that Yara had initially assumed was medical. It was not medical. She had understood that in the 3rd minute, she had kept watching, because her orders said she would keep watching, and Yara Ose kept her orders. The hand withdrew something small and translucent and folded it carefully, with a deliberateness that she had come to associate with Keth ritual behavior. The motion was unhurried, practiced, the way a person folds a letter they have written many times. The recording ended. Yara pulled her notepad from her thigh pocket and wrote the time, then 2 words. And familiar. She stared at those words for a moment, then added a third. Inventory. She reached for the next tape. The collection had been recovered from a Keth relay station 6 days earlier by a 4-person reconnaissance team operating under call sign Quarrel. The station itself had been abandoned, not destroyed, not evacuated in panic, but abandoned in the way a person abandons a finished meal, pushing the plate aside and moving on. Everything in order, everything intact, 47 cassettes in a sealed case, each one labeled in the Keth script that human linguists had been working on for 3 years and could now read at roughly the comprehension level of a motivated 2nd grader. The case itself was the anomaly. Keth data systems were biological, grown rather than manufactured, and they did not use magnetic recording media. The cassettes were human technology. Specifically, they were the same format as the compact audio cassettes that had been standard issue for field communications until 17 years ago, when the military switched to encrypted digital burst transmission. The cassettes were antiques by any reasonable measure, and the Keth had 47 of them, each one clearly used, each one labeled in their own hand. Nobody at command had been able to explain that yet. Yara was working on it. The 2nd tape was different from the first, less disturbing in one way, more disturbing in another. It was surveillance footage, or something functionally equivalent to surveillance footage. A fixed perspective, a single unmoving frame, courting a space that appeared to be a human habitation. The furniture was human. The proportions were human. There were shoes near the door, 3 pairs in the casual cluster that Yara recognized from her own apartment, the small domestic geography of a person who always took off their shoes in the same spot. There was a jacket hanging on the back of a chair. There was a cup on a table with something dried and brown at the bottom that had once been coffee or tea. There was no person. Tape ran for 9 minutes and 57 seconds and showed an empty room. But something had been in it recently. The blanket on the couch was pushed to one side in the shape of a person who had just stood up. The magazines on the table were fanned open as if someone had been flipping through them. The jacket on the chair swung very slightly, tiny pendulum motion of a garment just disturbed. Someone had just left, or had been taken. Yara rewound the tape and watched the jacket swing for a long time, she wrote. Occupied until recently question. Where are the people? Lieutenant Deck Farrow found her on tape 9. He came in with 2 cups from the mess fabricator. 1 black coffee. 1 the approximation of chamomile that Yara drank when she had been awake too long, and he set hers on the shelf beside her, without a word, pulled a second folding chair and sat down. Farrow was the kind of officer who understood that some intelligence work required silence from everyone in the room, including the people not doing the work. She pressed pause and accepted the cup. "Anything," he said. "I don't know yet." She turned the cup in her hands. The herbal approximation of chamomile smelled, as it always did, faintly of the plasticizer in the fabricator's nozzle housing, which had never been fully purged in the 3 months she'd been at Mira. She drank it anyway. The first tape is a Keth handling something from a biological specimen container. The second through eighth are surveillance footage of human habitations. All recent, all empty. Farrow was quiet. This one, she gestured at the paused frame on the screen, is different. "Come look," he leaned forward. The paused frame showed a room that was clearly Keth in origin. The curved organic architecture, the bioluminescent wall panels, the furniture that was less furniture, and more a series of contoured surfaces that a Keth body could drape itself across in the way that Keth heard. But in the center of the room, perfectly incongruous, was a human desk. A cheap pressboard thing, the kind sold in flat-pack boxes, self-assembled, the kind that wobbled slightly on its fourth leg if you put too much weight on the right side. Yara knew this because she had owned one exactly like it for 6 years and had never fixed the wobble. She recognized the model. On the desk was a cassette player, a human one. Battery-powered, the old consumer kind with the flip-up lid and the foam headphones coiled around it. The orange plastic casing was cracked along one edge. A Keth was sitting at the desk, its long spine curved in the particular arc that indicated concentration, and it was listening. "They're playing our tapes back," Farrow said. "They're playing our tapes back," Yara agreed. She understood by tape 12 that the Keth were students. Not students in the sense of infiltrators or spies running a clandestine analysis operation, though the effect was similar. Students in the more fundamental sense, beings who did not know something and were trying to learn it. The surveillance footage was not intelligence gathering in any tactical sense. There were no military installations in it, no weapons caches, no communications infrastructure. It was apartments, homes, a laundromat, a corner shop at what appeared to be 2 in the morning, clerk, half asleep behind the counter. A child's bedroom at night, the nightlight burning, the stuffed animals ranked on the shelf. They were studying how humans lived. Tape 14 was the one that made her stop breathing for a moment. It showed a kitchen. Specifically, it showed a woman in a kitchen, making what appeared to be bread. Hands moving through the familiar motions. Flour, water, the slow work of kneading. The woman was humming something. The recording quality was too compressed to identify the tune. But the rhythm of it came through, the simple rising-falling pattern of a person singing to themselves, because they were at home, and there was no particular reason not to. The woman shaped the loaf, scored the top with a knife in a quick diagonal cross, and slid it into the oven. Then she turned around and saw the camera. The tape cut to black 2 seconds later. Yara sat with that for a long time. Long enough that Farrow came back and found her not moving. "Os. They were in the homes," she said. "They were physically present. That's why the rooms were empty. The people left when they found the Keth. Or were removed." She looked up. "Deck. These aren't reconnaissance tapes. I think these are the Keth equivalent of home videos." Farrow stared at the black screen. "They're keeping them," he said finally. "Like souvenirs. Preet. Memories." She turned back to the screen. "I think the Keth are trying to understand us. Not our weapons, not our infrastructure. Us. How we move around our spaces. What we do when we think no one is watching." She paused. "The woman making bread, she was humming. The Keth recorded that. They kept it. That's what's on C-Stay tapes. The parts of human life they found worth preserving. That's..." Farrow stopped. "Terrifying," Yara said. "Yes." She slept for 4 hours on the cot in the corner of the evidence lockup and dreamed about her mother's kitchen. The smell of groundnut soup, the radio on the windowsill playing songs her mother knew all the words to. Her mother's hands moving. The light coming through the window in the way it came through that window, and no other window in the world. She woke up and pressed play on tape 17. By tape 23, she had a working theory. And it was worse than any of the alternatives. The Keth were not at war with humanity in the way that humanity understood war. They were not trying to defeat a military force or acquire territory or eliminate a rival power. They were engaged in something closer to documentation. A species-level archival project, of which the 47 tapes were a tiny fragment, and the fighting, the actual combat that had cost 14,000 human lives in the past 3 years, was something adjacent to the main project rather than the point of it. They were cataloging humanity. They were building a record. Records were made of things that were ending. Yara sat with this understanding for a long time. She turned it over carefully, the way she had learned to turn over intelligence, looking for the angle where it became something else, something more manageable. She was a careful analyst. She did not accept the first reading of anything. She looked for alternative interpretations, the biases in her own perception that might be shaping what she saw. She kept coming back to the same place. The Keth were building a record of humanity, because they expected that humanity would, at some point, no longer exist to document itself. She reached for tape 24. Tape 24 was the first tape that showed a Keth that knew it was being recorded. The others had all been candid, surveillance, or observations made without the subject's awareness. This one was different. A single Keth, seated in a space that appeared to be a formal setting, facing the camera with the particular stillness that Yara had come to associate with Keth, deliberateness. The bioluminescent tracery along its forearms pulsed slowly, the pattern that Keth linguists had identified as correlating with states of contemplation or formal address. It spoke for approximately 4 minutes. The words were Keth vocalizations, far outside the range of human decoding without significant processing. But the posture was unmistakable. Yara had spent 9 years learning to read the nonverbal content of communications in multiple languages and cultures, and what she was looking at was the posture of a person who was recording something for the record. Speaking to a future audience, archiving their own perspective for whoever might someday retrieve it. She wrote, "They know someone will find these. They left them to be found." She stared at those words. They left them to be found. She looked at the sealed case sitting on the shelf beside her, its lid open, the remaining tapes neatly arrayed inside. She looked at the careful labeling. She thought about the relay station that had been abandoned in perfect order. Nothing broken, nothing scrambled, everything intact. She thought about a reconnaissance team being led to a building by a signal they had tracked, and finding inside it an unlocked room and a sealed case with 47 cassettes. She rewound tape 24 and watched it again. The Keth's posture, the way it addressed the camera directly, the pulse of the bioluminescent tracery. She wrote one more word. Message. She was on tape 31 when the lights went out. Not a power failure, the screen stayed on. Its light suddenly the only light in the room, and the orange status indicators on the door locks and the environmental systems stayed green. Someone had manually cut the overheads, standard procedure for facility-wide alert status. Then the proximity alarm went off. Then the whole base alarm. Then Pharaoh's voice on the intercom, and fast. "OC, we have a contact, you need to hear this." She ejected the tape and put it in her pocket without thinking about why. Some instinct. She grabbed her notepad and the case of remaining tapes and was out the door in 20 seconds. The operations center was chaos organized into something that looked like calm. 3 screens showing sensor data, 2 officers on comm links, cluster of analysts at workstations running whatever they could run. Pharaoh was at the central display. "How close?" she said. 2 kilometers and closing. Single contact, which is unusual. He pulled up the sensor reading. "Profile doesn't match anything in our database. It's not combat configured. No weapon signature at all. It's not here to fight." Pharaoh looked at her. "Ozzy, it's here to talk." She set the case of tapes on the nearest flat surface and opened it. "Deck, how long have we been assuming that the Keth are at war with us? That this is a military action from their side?" 3 years. What if we're wrong? What if we've been misreading the entire situation from the start? She turned tape 24 over in her hands. "The Keth are doing something we've never seen a species do. They're archiving us. They're keeping records of how we live. Not how we fight, not how we defend ourselves, how we make bread, how we organize our shoes by the door, how we arrange stuffed animals on a shelf. She looked at him. They think we're ending, and they want to remember us accurately. The room had gone quiet around them. She was aware of the other analysts listening, but she didn't stop. There's a tape in this collection where a Keth speaks directly to the camera, knows it's being recorded, addresses a future audience. She held up the cassette. They left this case to be found. They left it at a relay station they deliberately vacated, tuned a signal we would track, unlocked the door. This was meant to reach us. She set the tape down on the console. The contact that's inbound right now, it came when we found the tapes. It's been watching to see what we'd do with them. Pharaoh looked at the sensor display. 1.8 kilometers. What do we do? Someone said from the back of the room. Yara picked up the tape. She walked to the communications array, where a young signals officer named Hendricks was watching her with very wide eyes. Do we have any playback capability on this interface? She said. Audio in, yes, I can do it. She handed him the tape. Play it on external broadcast. As wide as the antenna array will go, Ozzy, Pharaoh said. It wasn't an objection, it was a question. They sent us a message, she said. The least we can do is let them know we received it. Hendricks had the tape patched in 90 seconds. Yara stood at the center of the operations center and listened to the Keth vocalization play through the external broadcast array out into the night and the 2 kilometers of open ground between the station and whatever was coming toward them. She could not understand the words. She understood the shape of the address, the posture of it, the intention. The contact stopped. On the sensor display, the single blip sat at 1.2 kilometers and did not move. Nobody breathed. Then something happened to the signal data that Hendricks scrambled to capture. A burst transmission, short, dense, structured. He had it on screen in 3 seconds, running it through every analytical package he had. His hands were moving fast. It's audio, he said. Keth audio, but it's structured like it's call and response. They're answering. Yara let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 3 years. Record it, she said. Record everything. The next 4 hours were the most important 4 hours in human history, and they were conducted through a chain of imperfect translation, hand signals, and a shared willingness to sit in the discomfort of not fully understanding each other and try again. The Keth, representative, singular, which was itself significant, they had sent one, as if to match the scale of the thing, stopped at the outer perimeter and stayed there. It did not cross the fence line. It transmitted in bursts. And Yara and Hendricks together built a working transcription in real time, pulling from the 3 years of linguistic analysis that the specialists had produced and running it through every available model. What they got was partial, fragmentary, like reading a letter where every third word has been obscured. But the shape of it was clear enough. The Keth had been watching humanity for longer than 3 years. They had been watching for much longer than that. They had watched other species too, in the past. The record went back far enough that Yara's mind slid off the numbers, and they had seen the pattern repeat. A species reaches a particular threshold of complexity. Its own complexity becomes its danger, and then, one way or another, it ends. Keth had tried, in other cases, to intervene. They had tried various forms of warning. None had worked. The species that received warnings interpreted them as threats. They responded with fear and aggression. The intervention accelerated the ending it had been designed to prevent. So the Keth had changed their approach. They documented instead. They kept the record. They preserved what could be preserved. And they waited to see if any species would, when the tapes were found, understand what they were looking at rather than reaching for a weapon. Yara thought about tape 2, the empty room, the jacket still swinging. She thought about tape 14, the woman making bread, humming, not yet aware of anyone watching. She thought about her own mother's kitchen, and the smell of ground nut soup and the radio on the windowsill. She looked at the sensor display. 1.2 kilometers. I need to go outside, she said. Pharaoh walked with her to the outer door and then stopped. He didn't try to stop her. That was the thing about Deck Pharaoh. He always understood the difference between the moment that required an objection and the moment that required someone to stand at the door and watch someone else walk into the dark. She had her comm unit, but she left her sidearm in the rack by the door. She thought about that for a moment and decided she was right to leave it. She stepped out. The night was cold and very clear. The sky at Mira was genuinely extraordinary on cloudless nights. They were far enough from any settlement to have actual darkness, the kind that showed you stars in their real density, not the attenuated smear visible from cities. She had come out here on her first week at the station and stood for a long time, just looking up, remembering that the universe was very large. She walked toward the fence line. At 1.1 kilometers, on the sensor display in the operations center, the blip began moving toward her. She stopped at 50 meters because 50 meters felt right. Close enough to see, far enough to think. The Keth was smaller than she had expected from the recordings. This was always the case with species encountered in person for the first time. The mental image built from data was always subtly wrong in scale. It was approximately her height, maybe slightly taller, and it moved the way she had seen in the recordings. Deliberate, unhurried, each motion complete before the next began. The bioluminescent tracery along its arms and throat pulsed slowly in the cold air, casting a faint blue-green light on the ground between them. It stopped at 30 meters. They looked at each other in the darkness for a long moment. Yara reached into her jacket pocket and took out the cassette from tape 24. She held it up so it could see. The Keth's tracing pulsed once, quick bright pattern, and then settled back to its slow rhythm. She set the tape on the ground carefully, with both hands, the way you set down something that matters. Then she stepped back. She reached into her other pocket and took out the notepad she had been writing in all day. She found the page where she had written the 3 words. Deliberate. Familiar. Inventory. And below those, further down, they left them to be found. And the last word. Message. She tore out the page and folded it once, the way she had been taught to fold a letter. 2 even halves, crisp at the crease, the habit of someone who wrote actual letters in a world that had mostly forgotten the practice. She set it on the ground next to the tape. She looked up. The Keth's tracery pulsed in a long, rolling pattern she didn't have a word for, took 3 steps forward. The same careful 3 steps, each one placed deliberately, and crouched near the tape and the folded paper. It was too dark to read the paper. Yara doubted the Keth could read her handwriting anyway. That wasn't the point. The point was the gesture. Folded letter, the 2 hands, the care. The Keth picked up the tape and held it with 4 fingers, the same 4-fingered grip she had watched on tape 1. The hands that had seemed so alien on a screen and seemed, here, 30 meters in the dark, considerably more like hands than she had expected. Then it picked up the folded paper. It didn't try to open it. It held both things for a moment, and then it placed the tape inside a compartment in its outer garment with the same care she had used to set them down. The paper it held in its open hand. It looked at her. She looked back. There was nothing to say that either of them had the language for yet. That was going to take a very long time. The work of years, probably decades. The patient accretion of shared vocabulary that could only come from being willing to sit in the difficulty of not fully understanding each other. And try again. Yara knew this work. It was the work she had been trained for. It was in a way the only work that had ever mattered to her. She nodded once. The Keth tilted its head in a motion that her brain read as acknowledgement, and she didn't know if that reading was accurate or a projection of human gesture mapping onto something alien, and she decided it didn't matter. The tilt was there. Something had happened in this 50-meter gap that hadn't existed before. That was enough to work with. She turned and walked back toward the station. Pharaoh was at the outer door. He held it open for her, and she walked through into the light and warmth, and he let the door close behind them without saying anything. What happens now? Someone said from the operations center. Yara was already moving toward the console, where the remaining tapes sat in their open case. She picked up tape 25. Now, she said, we learned to listen. The transcription work took 9 weeks. The Keth representative, they eventually had a designation for it, a phonetic approximation of its name that Hendricks started using, and which spread through the station's population with the naturalness of things. that are adopted before anyone decides to adopt them, stayed at the perimeter for the first 3 days. On the 4th day, Yara walked out again, and this time she brought 2 mugs of the herbal approximation of chamomile and set one on the ground at the midpoint between herself and the keth and stepped back. This was a gesture that she understood to be potentially meaningless or potentially significant, and she made it anyway because the alternative was standing still, and Yara Osi was constitutionally incapable of standing still when there was work to do. The keth did not drink the chamomile, but it came and stood near it for a long time. The next day she brought a chair and sat in the cold. 2 days after that, the keth brought something, a small device that emitted a low-frequency tone, not quite sound, more like the pressure memory of sound, and set it on the ground and sat on its heels near it in the keth approximation of settled. And they sat together at 50 meters and did not speak for 2 hours, because they did not yet have the language. This was how first contact had always actually worked. Yara understood, not a moment, not a declaration. A series of small consistent gestures made across a distance that was not just physical, each one saying the same thing. I'm still here, I am not a threat, I will come back tomorrow. Tapes gave them a foundation. The keth's archive of human habitation, the apartments, the corner shop, the woman making bread, had been built from careful observation but no interaction. It was rich in surface detail and thin on context. Keth knew what human shoes looked like and how humans clustered them by doors, but they did not know why. They knew what bread was but not what it meant, which was most of what bread was. Yara spent 4 weeks explaining context, working through Hendrix and the transcription software, building shared vocabulary word by patient word. She started with the things that had appeared on the tapes and worked outward. Shoes by the door, a transition marker, a boundary between outside and inside, the spatial grammar of home. The jacket on the chair, a person interrupted mid-thought, meaning to return. Coffee dried in the cup bottom. Time, passage. The small evidence that a life had moved on from one moment to the next. The keth listened and asked, in their fragmented translated way, why humans kept evidence of time's passage in their living spaces, rather than removing it. Yara thought about this for a long time before answering. Because it meant someone had been there, she said eventually, because emptiness was the thing that was hard to look at. The keth was quiet for 3 days after that. On the 41st day, walked out to the perimeter in the early morning before anyone else was awake. The sky was still dark, the stars dense overhead. The keth was already there, waiting in the pre-dawn cold which it did not seem to feel, its tracery slow and dim in the darkness. She had tape 38 under her arm. She hadn't played it yet. She had been carrying it for a week, setting it down and picking it up again. And she had finally decided that she needed to watch it with someone else in the room. And this was as close as she was going to get to that. She set up the small portable player she had brought out, a human device, battery-powered, and sat cross-legged on the cold ground and pressed play. Tape 38 was longer than the others, 23 minutes. It showed a space she had come to understand was a keth archive, the biological equivalent of a library, a long, high-ceilinged organic chamber, lined with storage media, in forms she could not always identify. Moving through the frame were 3 keth, working with the slow deliberateness of archivists, cataloging, arranging, preserving. They were the same species that had fought and killed 14,000 humans. They were handling their materials with the care of people who understood that things mattered. Yara watched the screen in the pre-dawn dark and tried to hold both of those things at once. At the 12-minute mark, one of the keth in the footage stopped working and looked directly at the camera. It was a brief pause, 4 or 5 seconds. Then it looked away and went back to work. She understood, watching it, why the keth had made these tapes for humans to find. An archive made by one species of another was ultimately also a record of the archivists. In trying to document humanity, the keth had documented themselves, their patience, their care, their particular way of handling things that mattered. The tapes were a self-portrait as much as they were a portrait. She pressed stop and sat in the dark. Beside her, she had not noticed the approach. The keth moved very quietly. The representative sat, not at 30 meters, beside her, close enough to touch, which neither of them did. Its tracery pulsed in the slow pattern she had come to understand as something between contemplation and presence. A state of simply being in a place and acknowledging that the place was real. Yara reached into her jacket pocket. She had been carrying this since the first day, and she had not taken it out until now. It was a photograph, printed on actual paper, which she had carried in her wallet for 12 years. Her mother in the kitchen, by the window, the radio visible in the background. Mid-law, at something Yara's brother had said just off-frame. The light through the window was the light she remembered. She held it out. The Keth took it with 4 careful fingers. It looked at the photograph for a long time. The tracery along its throat and arms pulsed through a slow sequence she had never seen before, rising and falling, something like the rhythm of the humming on tape 14. Not music, not language, but a pattern of attention. Response to something that mattered. She let it look. "That's my mother, she said, knowing the words meant nothing yet. Knowing she was saying them anyway. She made groundnut soup, and she listened to the radio, and she never learned to not hum along even when she didn't know the words. She's still alive. She's still in that kitchen." She paused. "I want you to know that the rooms on your tapes weren't empty when they were full. That what you were recording is still happening." The Keth's tracery ran through its long rolling pattern, the one she didn't have a word for. She thought maybe it was a response, that her language didn't have the shape to carry yet. That was all right. They were working on it. She took the photograph back gently, and the Keth let it go with the same care it had used to take it. The sky was getting lighter. In an hour the station would wake up around them, and the work would resume. The slow, painstaking, necessary work of building enough shared language to ask the questions that needed asking and hear the answers that needed hearing. There was so much of it ahead, years of it, possibly a whole human lifetime. Yara looked up at the last of the stars and thought, good. She had always been better at sustained effort than anything else. Better at listening than at speaking. Better at sitting in the difficulty of not understanding and trying again than at anything that required the certainty of already knowing. She thought about tape 14, the woman in the kitchen, the scored loaf going into the oven, the turned head, the 2-second look at the camera before the tape cut to black. She thought that woman was not afraid. She was surprised, and then she was looking, directly, without flinching. That was the most human thing on any of the tapes. Yara had watched 47 cassettes of evidence that the Keth found humanity worth recording, worth preserving, worth the extraordinary care of a species-wide archival project spanning decades and distances she couldn't fully imagine. She had found, in return, 47 cassettes of evidence that the Keth were worth talking to. It wasn't everything. It was not a solved problem, or a sealed peace, or an end to the fighting, which would take much longer and much harder work, the kind of work that no single person could complete. It was a beginning, a photograph, a folded page of notes, beings sitting in the cold and watching the sky get lighter. A message received. Yara Ose, Signals Intelligence Analyst, pressed play on her life, and got back to work.